The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Travis McGrath. Thank you for joining us for today's Exago Support Lab. I'm really excited today. I actually get to the pleasure of giving the first sneak peek at our version 2019.1 release. This is going to be our first major release of the year. This release has a lot of back-end focus, particularly around performance. And so what I want to do today is showcase one of the new features and talk about how it impacts performance. As always, these labs are recorded, and just to make sure you can have all your questions answered, in the right-hand panel of our GoToWebinar, we have a questions box. If you could give me a check, a Y, a yes, a good day, just to make sure you can hear me okay and see my screen. All right, I see some yeses coming in. That's great. At any point, as always, if you ever want, to back up, slow down, go into detail, a couple of my colleagues will be answering questions there, and they'll point out to me if any are good for the general group. Okay, perfect. So with that, let's dive into it. And just to start out, we're going to talk about what changed, when to use this new feature, of course, how to do it, and we'll give a live demo of how to set it up, and some of the implications around using this feature in terms of updating. We'll talk about some specific notes later on. All right, so first off, what changed? And the answer might surprise you here. Nothing. Sort of. Nothing will have changed without some action after you upgrade. So this is a feature that isn't quote unquote enabled by default. We have changed some of our processing, but if you upgrade to 2019.1 and you don't take any of the actions we're going to outline down later on in the presentation, you won't see any changes for good or for bad. There won't be any real change to your environment and how it works. Okay, so really, what did we change? So what we changed was how we load configuration files. Specifically, we've created two types of config files. So the configuration files are the XML files that are created when you save our admin console, and they're what let you control what data sources, what data objects, joins, and settings Exago uses. So we've created two types of config files, static configs and dynamic configs. And what this is going to let us do is load one static configuration when Exago first starts. So when your server, IS or Apache first starts, it'll load one file. And that file will be stored in memory, and then the dynamic files will be loaded on top of that. So what do I mean by that? So a static file, this is going to be the config file that contains any unchanging settings. So any settings you've placed in the admin console that you're not going to change per user or per session via the API. Typically, these will be things like general settings, so your report path, your temp path, various scheduler settings particularly. Most of those aren't going to change per user or per session, right? So there we have a list. And your dynamic config is going to be the XML, the things that you do intend to change via the API. So typically these will be things like roles, some data objects, and maybe data source properties. So if you're changing your database connection string dynamically, and definitely parameters. That's going to be the most obvious one because your parameters are, by definition, meant to hold values and be updated through the API. Okay, great. So we have this definition of your static configs and your dynamic configs. So prior to 19.1, so in the 19.2 and before, how did Exago work? And what happened was when you launch a session, you specify the base config file. So you could already have multiple config files. That's not new. But you would specify one config file as you load a session through the API. And this is true for REST or the .NET API. So whether you're using our web service or the .NET API, same thing applies here. And then you would make some specific changes for that session, and those would be saved as a Think of delta as just a difference if you're not a very mappy person. Then what would happen is every time the server had to do a callback, from the end user's perspective, anytime they opened a new menu or loaded a report, they would do a callback from their browser to the server, and the config file would have to be loaded and that delta would have to be applied. So that means we would have to read the config file, every time there was a server-side callback. In general, that's not a big deal if you have a small config, but having the read and something called a diffgram done to apply the delta for large config files could see some impact on performance. So this is why we made this change, really to help cases where you have large config files. We've seen clients who have hundreds of data objects, all with column metadata. Those XML files can get very large. And instead of having to load them with each column, we now have a new solution. A great question came up. What config file is considered large? So we saw end user setups for some clients who have config files that are hundreds of megabytes. Depending on your server, it's a very sort of dynamic question. So that's something that is a little hard to put a number to, but in performance issues and you have more than 50 or 100 data objects with column metadata, it very might well be that you could see some improvement from using this feature. So that would be something I would consider large. Great. So now in 2019.1, I've already sort of explained this, but to go into exact detail here, what happens is these static config files are going to be stored in memory once as Exago starts, so as your server loads Exago. And then the dynamic config files are what get loaded during callbacks, and those stack up on top of the static configs. Of course, you still have your ability to use the API changes, but we only have to do reads for server-side callbacks against these much smaller dynamic config files. So again, this is a performance-minded process. Okay, so the question might be, should I use this? And my answer here is that you might take advantage of this if you have a couple of different, if you meet a couple of different requirements. One, you have a very large config file. Two is that you have multiple config files. So you've set up Exago already so that you have a whole bunch of config files, but each one only has a couple of differences from the others. So 90% of your values are the same, and then you're making a few changes just per user to your base config. You might take advantage of this then because you could have one static config file and then keep those smaller changes in just these dynamic files. So that would give you the advantage of not having to maintain quite so many large files. And then the last one is if you want to optimize performance. If you're a Formula One type person and you want every ounce of weight off your car, every optimal thing, this is of course a performance optimization. So it might be something you take advantage of just because you want to drive performance to be as fast as it can. Okay, so we've talked about what it is and why you should use it. Now the question is how to use it. So the first thing you want to do is determine the API changes you're making. So look at your host application and determine what are the changes we're making. Are we creating roles dynamically, or are we taking existing roles and modifying them? Are we changing data source connection strings? Are we maybe changing some of the general settings for specific users? Look at what API changes you're making. In the admin console, we're going to create a static config file. And then we're going to create a new dynamic config file to sit on top of that. And then we're going to adjust the dynamic config file to know that it should sit on top of the static config file. All right, so this sounds a little abstract. You might say, like, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So what we can do here is actually try this. So here I'm in my local installation. I have it on my local machine, and I already have two config files just because I do things a little differently here. We have our normal base web reports.xml file, but I have one I call demo config. So this is the one we're going to be using today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy of demo config, and I'm going to call this one static. And then I'm going to make another copy and call this one dynamic. Right, now I made a copy here because this gives me a backup. If I do something wrong, I have my backup file. I can do this sort of stress-free. So always having a backup is a good idea. It's not doing any harm having this extra file around. I'm going to leave the static one alone for just a moment and go to the dynamic config file. And since it's just XML, I'm actually just going to open it up here. And what I can do is, as always, our config files contain a number of things. So we have our general settings from the admin console, data sources we've defined, parameters, etc. Now, I know in my environment, in our API environment that we've shown in previous labs, that we sometimes change some things about the data source, and we definitely change parameters. So I'm going to leave all this alone. But I know in our environment that we actually don't make changes to entities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through here, just select all these entities and hit delete. And I'm actually going to do the same thing with our joins and our categories. So you've seen that we've set these up before in our labs about the multiple data models, but everything was set up in the config file, so we don't need to make changes here dynamically. So I'm just going to hit delete again. Same thing for our custom functions. I'm not changing any of our custom functions, server or action events via the API. So I'm going to take all these extensibility features and I'm going to delete them as well. Again, I can do all of this pretty stress-free because I have a backup. And actually at the moment, I have 2 backups. Okay, so I'm going to hit save. And what I'll notice is I left my role. I do know that I occasionally will change the role via the API or create a new role. So I'm going to leave that there. That's fine. And the other thing I can do if I want is take out my general settings as well. Right, so we'll just scroll through here, leave those, and make sure we don't leave any extraneous, and then just hit save. So there I've got my sort of pared down config file. So if I come back here, just do a refresh, you'll notice my static config. Again, I'm working in a relatively small config file. Mine is still measuring in kilobytes, but is now my dynamic config is now about 1/10 the size my static config. Great. So I'm going to go over to the admin console, and here I'm just going to go to admin.aspx. By default, it'll look for web reports.xml, but I'll notice that it gives me an option in the dropdown to modify any of the existing config files I want. So here, I'm going to go to our static config file first. And you'll notice now there's a new option in our app that says config options and the config type. So by default, all existing configuration files are going to be dynamic configs. Now here, I'm going to change this one to be our static config. Not surprising, I put the word static in the title. I can give it a lifespan, but I want this file to stick around, so I'm not, I can just leave it as 0 and that'll be here indefinitely. And I could give it a parent config if I had other static configs, so if you sort of wanted to chain these together, but I really don't. I think this is fine. So I'm going to hit OK here. And then I'm going to go to my dynamic config. And again, that's going to be from this dropdown because we manually created these files. And I'm going to go to the config changes here. I still want it to be a dynamic file, but I wanted to know that it is really only meant to be used on top of the static configuration from before. So here under parent configuration, I'm going to go to static config. And with that, that's really all I have to do. Now, when I load Exago, if I specify that it should load the demo config -dynamic in the API, it will load that file, and it'll actually have this static file already in memory, and it'll know to add them together to make one sort of effective configuration with all my settings. to highlight. One thing to note here is that once you've created a static config file, so here this config type is static, this is now loaded and stored in memory. What that means though is if I go into one of my other settings, so let's say I want to make a change to my programmable object settings, that change will effectively happen in the XML file, but it won't propagate to Exago unless you do a restart on your server. So in my case, because I'm on a Windows machine, that can be as simple as just doing a IAS restart down here. But that's how you would, so if you're in a Linux environment, you could refresh Apache as well. Great. So I just want to pause there, have a second to read the other questions that might have come in around how to use this feature. Another great question came in under the config lifespan. The question was, what are the units there? And I believe those are in minutes, but I can have one of my colleagues who's answering the questions double check that and confirm before the lab ends here. All right, so we've talked about how to use it, right? We determine what we're changing, we make new config files, calling one static and the other dynamic, and then we set the dynamics file to be have its parent be the static file, and of course we set the static file to be static. Okay, so what are the important notes here? It's a pretty simple feature to set up, but there are a few important considerations. The one really useful one here is that the static config files should be copied to these. There's a new folder in your scheduling service and the web service components of Exago. So when you do a standard update, you update all of those modules of Exago, so the web app, the web service, and the scheduler, if you're using those other two. Inside each of these, you'll now see a config folder. And if you make a static config file, you'll want to copy that file to these new folders. In the API, so as you launch Exago via REST or the .NET API, when you instantiate an API object or you post a session in the REST version, and we've covered the API before, so if you want to see an example of this, we can link to a past lab on it. You'll want to specify to use the dynamic config file whose parent points to the static. One neat thing about this is we have a setting in the admin console called schema access or global schema access. And what it does is it tells Exago when it needs the schema of a data object, so that is information about what columns are available. It can either look in the column metadata, which you can define for each data object, or it can query the database with a query that's going to return back just the schema and no data, no rows. Now with this, previously there had been a sort of pros and cons to using this global schema access as column metadata because it meant loading and maintaining larger config files. Now that this change has been in place and there's no performance hit to using these larger config files, our recommendation is to use the column metadata for schema access. It'll reduce the number of calls to your data source, which of course will improve performance. Okay, we've got a few more notes. Bear with me here. So there have been some changes to the .NET API structures. Specifically, most objects now have a property around allowing update. So your data sources, your joins, and your roles that are not in the dynamic config file will require some special code if you're using the .NET API. So for example, here, your API objects, there's on the roles collection, there's going to be a property called allow update. All right, and the last page of notes here, we're just going to continue again. I mentioned the static configs. If you make changes after making them static, require a server reset here. The other thing I want to mention is the admin console will only save things that are different between dynamic config files if they have a static config file as their parent. So if you set up your config files like we just showed a moment ago, and then you go to the dynamic config and make changes, it will only save the changes that are different between the dynamic and static config files, which is good. That's all you really want to have in that file anyway. All right, and then lastly, in our knowledge base, when the version 2019.1 is released, of course, there will be an article detailing this. It'll actually say a lot of the same things we've covered in the lab, but it'll be in much greater detail and have a great FAQ section at the bottom. So I definitely recommend, as you look at this feature, to look at that article, which of course will be linked below the recording of this support lab on our knowledge base as well. And then lastly, I just want to make a note. Reach out to us if you ever have any questions on any features. Through the knowledge base, you can ask questions. We have a form for that, and of course, my team, the client services team, is here as well. So as you go to upgrade, if you have any questions about how to use this feature beyond what we've covered in today's support lab and what I'm sure are being asked right now, which we'll look at in just a moment, please always feel free to reach out to our team. We like helping our clients upgrade. That's one of actually the most fun parts of our job. There are a lot of questions here, so I'm just going to pause and read through the questions to see if any are applicable to the whole group here. Right off the bat, I see a great one, which is, what's the ETA on 2019.1's release? So the ETA is going to be early next month. Our target release date is May 3rd, so that's actually just coming around the corner. So it's going to be here soon, which is why we're doing a sort of sneak peek discussion of some of the new features. Okay, I think those are the questions that are applicable to the whole group. A few of my colleagues are answering questions as well, and if we don't answer your question, we can follow up with you after. So with that, I want to close out today by saying next month, we actually haven't determined our lab topics yet. So as always, when the webinar ends, we have a short survey just for some feedback. If there are any topics you want us to cover, anything at all, be it how to build specific types of reports or administrative or anything at all, other new features, we're definitely going to be covering some 19.1 features in next month and of course June's labs as well. But we want to hear from you. What topics do you want to hear, to see, to have more information on? Great. So with that, I'll close out and just say thanks for attending today's lab. I hope you're as excited about our 2019.1 release as I am, and happy reporting.